many ladies here. That's awesome. I was going to mention when I first started talking with Gina, trying to select who I wanted to speak about, we talked about Sara, and I thought, you know what? I can kind of relate to Sara a little bit. Maybe we all can in different ways, but I got married in my 30s. I was older when I became a mom. Fortunately, I wasn't 90, so that was a big help. But I think the similarities may stop there. I never called my husband Lord, and I've definitely never given a handmaiden with whom to have a child. So. Anyway, tonight I'd like to talk with you about Sara. I think we're pretty familiar with her, but we're really aware of her infertility struggles. But there's more to her than that. What do we know about her, and what can we learn from her life? Sometimes we refer to people in the Bible as characters. We'll say this Bible character, that Bible character. I'm not really sure where that came from, but I personally don't care for it too much because I feel like that kind of makes people seem like these two-dimensional beings that didn't feel and experience life and temptation and emotions and all the things that we experience. So, as we know, the people in the Bible were real, and Sara was very real, okay? So, see if I can do this. Oops, sorry. Okay, so this is just my thought. I think the Bible, it can be said that the Bible is a tapestry of interwoven stories. It's hard to kind of isolate one person, particularly Abraham and Sara. I didn't feel like I could really talk about Sara without talking about Abraham a fair amount because they're so tied together. What do we know about Sara? Was she virtuous? Was she honored? Or was she flawed with jealousy and fits of anger? Yes, she was all of these, though the Bible ultimately focuses on her positive virtues. We first meet Sara, or Sarai, as she was originally named, in Genesis 11:29. And for this presentation, I'm just going to call them Abraham and Sara. I was trying to kind of be totally correct when I was writing this, and even I was getting confused. So we know that they were Abram and Sarah originally, and then God renamed them. And we'll talk about that in a little while. Historical accounts tell us that Sara may have come from a wealthy family, and that maybe she was a little bit pampered. That's not in the Bible. We're also told that she was extremely physically beautiful, and that is in the Bible. So she is the half-sister of Abraham. They share the same father, Terah, but not the same mother. And she was also 10 years younger than Abraham. Okay, and as I mentioned, Sara and Abraham, their story is so intertwined. You almost even can't talk about Abraham without talking about Sara. Abraham was part of the 9th generation, descended from Shem. He was born and raised in Ur. That was an important city in Mesopotamia, and historians tell us it was the center of a highly developed pagan culture. It's interesting to know that both Abraham and Sarah were raised in urban environments. And I'm sorry, I meant to kind of plug this book. This is the book, I guess Gina chose it. Anyway, it's a fantastic book. Lots of details, lots of more introspective study than just a surface. But it was really interesting to sort of use that as a starting point and really kind of do a deep dive on Sara. So, I guess I always thought about Abraham and Sara, out in the desert and moving and moving and moving as though that was their life from the very beginning. But that was not their life from the beginning. They were urbanites. Okay. So, I think maybe one of the primary themes that might come to mind when we think of Sara is her barrenness. So I was kind of surprised when I started studying her. So she's first mentioned, her name is first mentioned in Genesis 11:29. Then immediately following in Genesis 11:30, this is the next verse. Now Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. To me, this kind of sets the stage for her entire life. So this problem not only haunted her, it kind of became part of her identity right from the very beginning. And as we know, being barren was very much looked down upon in the Bible. It was kind of an ongoing embarrassment for a woman, It could send her in kind of to a tailspin of despair, and her value often seemed to be directly tied to this. So the author of this book states about Sara, every recorded episode of ill temper or strife in her household was related to her frustration with her own barrenness. Sara often seemed overwhelmingly consumed with this problem and very much grief-stricken as a result. And as we know, she did remain barren until the age of 90. And we will get to the happy part. Obviously, she was tortured by this. The author wondered, and I hadn't really ever thought about this. He said, the sense that everything somehow hinged on her must have pressed on her like a great burden. Abraham could not become a great patriarch if she could not provide an heir. Obviously, eventually, God's promise was fulfilled. Sara is joined, as we know, by other women in the Bible who were barren: Hannah, Rachel, Elizabeth, just to name a few. And as we know, this was a very just severe, intense problem and burden that these women bore. Okay, so as I mentioned, Abraham and Sarah, as we understand it from historical accounts, were urbanites. In Genesis 11:31, before God talks to Abraham, Genesis 11:31 states, Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of her Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. When they came to Haran, they settled there. So we're not told why Terah moved his family at that point. And again, if y'all have more Bible knowledge than I do, please help me or talk to me afterwards. I've done the best I can with this. Terah had 3 sons, and Haran was one of Abraham's brother, and he passed away. So I don't know if that had something to do with Terah moving. And I also don't understand why, and maybe y'all could tell me at some point, why Sarai is referred to as Terah's daughter-in-law when she was his daughter. I don't know. Anyway, okay, that was a question I had that I wanted. Anyway, that was a rabbit hole I didn't have time to look into. Okay, so you can see I got very distracted with these details. It's just so interesting. So God shares his covenant with Abraham for the first time in Genesis 12:1. The Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. And he also shares this covenant. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. So according to Scripture, even though Sarah was not a part of this experience at that moment, she understood the promises, this promise, as we're told in Galatians 3:8. So at the age of 75, Abraham left along with his wife and nephew, and then they arrived in Canaan. The Lord appears to Abraham again in Genesis 12:7 at the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. He says, to your offspring I will give this land. And there Abraham built an altar. At this point, and I'm not sure that I have all the chronology correct, let's just say there's a lot of moves, because they were from Ur to Haran to Shechem to Bethel to Negev. I think Canaan is in there somewhere. At one point they visit Egypt. We'll talk about that. Then back to Negev, then to Bethel. To me, that's a lot of moving. I don't know about y'all. I don't like to move. I've been in the same house over 25 years. I don't like moving. I especially don't like moving in a tent. I thought, how would we feel if we're in our home, or we live in an apartment, we live in a home, we live in a duplex, we're in this permanent house, we have food, we have health care, we have a job, and your company comes to you and says, hey, you know what, I need to transfer you, we're gonna put you in the desert, we're gonna set you up in a tent, somehow we're gonna get Wi-Fi there, and just trust us, we'll give you the password. I'm like, I would not be on board, and granted, this was God and not a company, but when I kind of tried to wrap my brain around that, that's a lot. And both of them, but I think of Sarah being, woman to woman, moving and living this nomadic life for decades, bleh. mean, that would be really hard, I think. So, anyway, as I mentioned a minute ago, due to a famine, Abraham and Sarah went to Egypt, and we're going to talk about that story. That's a little, another not great part of their story, but Abraham returns to Negev and then to Bethel. Hebrews 11:9-10 says, prompted by faith, he dwelt as a temporary resident in the land which was designated in the promise of God, though he was like a stranger in a strange country, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs with him of the same promise. And then we know that after a quarrel with his nephew Lot, that he eventually ended up moving to Canaan. Again, Abraham and Sarah raised in an urban environment, but obeyed God and lived the nomadic life. So, as we know, God spoke to Abraham on different occasions. And I didn't really realize that it was so many times. I guess I just thought of it as once or twice. But it's awesome when you study the Bible, because there's so much to learn. And I didn't realize, I think I've kind of alluded to it, that Sarah was not included in these promises explicitly until the very end. So, I mean, it's implied, but she wasn't present and she wasn't called out specifically. And so maybe that doesn't make a difference, but I just thought it was sort of an interesting detail. The first time God talks with Abraham, Genesis 12:3, Abraham's 75, he said he'd make him a father of a great nation. Then in Genesis 13:16, Abraham's seed would be as great as the dust of the earth. Then in Genesis 15:1-6, Abraham's seed would be like the stars of the sky. Then the fourth time, the covenant is renewed and reiterated, expanding the promise. Each time, maybe not every single time, but many of the times, each time God appears, the promise and the covenant sort of gets bigger. And God is giving him this covenant. It's kind of a blank check. It's not, if you do this, I'll do this. God's just saying, I'm going to do this. This is gonna be your life. I'm going to give all this to you. And he's not hinging it on Abraham's obedience or any certain list of things he's supposed to do. It's amazing when I thought about it, I thought he's promising him just unfathomable life ahead of him. It was at this point in Genesis 17:4 that God says that many nations would come from Abraham and kings shall come from you. This is the point where God changes Abraham's name and Sarah's name. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Circumcision becomes a sign of the formal covenant. God reveals himself with a new name, El Shaddai, Almighty God. I always think of that Amy Grant song. This is the first time Sarah is called in by name in the promise, even though there's no indication that she was present to hear it. God gives them a specific time frame this time, so after nearly 24 years, this time next year you will have a son. Abraham and his household are circumcised, and then another time God appears again. At this time, 2 men are sent, angels, to speak with Abraham. Sarah hears them. Both Abraham and Sarah laugh. And I didn't realize, I guess it was last year? I cannot remember which girl did a speech and talked about Abraham laughing when God told him he was going to have a son. And I was like, that's not right. We're going to have to look this up. And I was like, no, that was right. It wasn't just Sarah. It was Abraham laughed as well. And, we have to wonder, could that just be from relief? Could that be from glad? I mean, I would think it's just, having waited a long time for our second child, when that happens, sometimes you're just so relieved. You're just so mixed with so many different emotions that it's hard to sort of express it all. Yes, and so anyway, we know that Sarah laughs and then denies it, and I can understand. I think she's fearful. Okay, so as faithful as Abraham and Sarah were, they did stumble a few times, and I'm not glad that they stumbled, but I am glad, I'm thankful that the Bible kind of tells us, the Bible gives us the good, bad, and the ugly, and that gives me hope, because I think if it was just about perfect people, then I would be up a creek. So I feel like their first mistake, or I'm calling out the big ones. And again, poor Sarah, poor Abraham, because I would not want my mistakes publicly scrutinized in a group like this. But while in Egypt, Abraham became very afraid that, okay, so they went to Egypt because of a famine. Okay, and so while in Egypt, Abraham came up with a plan. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. Okay, so on the surface, like in the preschool classes, we think, oh, that's kind of weird, but okay. When you really think about it, this was very dangerous for Sarah. If this king took her into his harem, and anyway, she agreed to it. I mean, she followed her husband. She agreed to this plan, even though it was not a good plan. It was a half-truth, which is not the truth. Pharaoh's household was then inflicted with various diseases. This sounds a little familiar because this is what's going to happen later on, a few hundred years later. Prior to finding out that Sarah was Abraham's wife, the Pharaoh had given Abraham, as just to show him favor, he gave him sheep, cattle, donkeys, servants, and camels. And then when Pharaoh found out the truth, then he couldn't get them out of there fast enough. And it's my understanding that they left with all of these, all of this livestock and everything else as well. So, and this is a whole other study that you could do, just Abraham's wealth, his earthly wealth, how it just increased and increased and increased and increased and increased. Okay, and I'm calling this mistake number 2, Hagar. Okay, so this is kind of, for us, this would feel like kind of, or it does to me, feel like kind of a biggie. So it was Sarah's idea to give her handmaiden Hagar to Abraham in order to have a child. Okay, I think at this point, maybe they're 12 years, is that correct, into the promise when God first appeared to Abraham. And they just don't see anything happening. And this was, my understanding, that was a common practice, somewhat of a common practice at that point. But anyway, I would not be on board with that. But anyway, so the author says, this is the first recorded case of polygamy involving a righteous man. God's design for marriage, as we're told throughout the Bible, is monogamy. So when we think of polygamy, we often think of the associated problems. You think of Jacob with Rachel and Leah, David, Solomon. It's just never a great plan to have more than one. I mean, I think one wife is plenty. And then, so Sarah tells Abraham, hey, I've got this plan, and Abraham agrees. And we don't, we're not really told the dynamics of that situation, if he was reluctant or not, or anyway. So once Hagar had conceived, Sarah knew this is a mistake. And then when Hagar saw that she had conceived, she despised her mistress. So we can just imagine the dynamics of that situation, like, stress city. This is the first recorded outburst of anger from Sarah is here. Then in Genesis 16:5, Sarah is angry with Abraham. Which I find kind of funny. But then I think, how many times have we gotten upset with somebody else? We talked them into doing something, or included them in something, or asked our husband to do something, and they do it, and then we get mad when it backfires, and it's like, I'm at fault here. Anyway, Sarah's extreme grief over her own barrenness had kind of just led her down this rabbit trail of just not good decisions in this situation. Abraham handed Hagar over to Sarah, avoiding both women, and to avoid the strife. In Genesis 16:6, Sarah dealt harshly with Hagar. An angel of the Lord appeared to Hagar and comforted her and spoke words of mercy and gentleness. A promise was given to her that I will multiply your descendants. And at that point, if if I'm understanding the chronology, if the Bible is written in chronological order, at this point, I don't think Sarah had been given a promise herself, but Hagar is given this promise. We're told that Ishmael will be a wild donkey of a man. I don't know, how would you feel if you're a mother and you're about to? I would think that would be a little questionable. And then Hagar acknowledged God as El Roy, the God who sees. And then we know the story when Isaac did come along, that there was a great feast on the day of his weaning, and Ishmael was making fun of him. And Sarah was not having it. She demanded that Abraham cast her out, and that was it. We are told later, much later in Genesis 25, that after Sarah's passing and then when Abraham passed away, that both sons did bury him. Okay, now the third mistake is really a repeat of the first mistake. So this time, Abraham asked Sarah to pose as his sister again in Negev, this time with Abimelech, the king of Gerar. This was, so again, if I'm reading things in chronological order, she would have been about 89. I cannot imagine, I can't imagine even now going somewhere and my husband saying, "You're so gorgeous that I need you to do this or I'm going to be killed." I'm like, I'm doing wrinkle cream and lotions and everything. I'm just trying to preserve what's there. You know, I cannot imagine being pushing 100 and you're so gorgeous that your husband is constantly fearful for his life. So kudos to her. I'm impressed. She must have been using the best oil of Olay there was. I don't know. So Abimelech was told in a dream of Sarah's true identity and became very afraid. And then, let's see, Abraham had told the king, "And when God had me wander from my father's household, I said to her," meaning Sarah, "This is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother." That's in Genesis 18:13. Ugh. So, you know, we're all flawed. We all sin. I think there are some sins that have more lasting consequences than others. Perhaps, I mean, we kind of call it in our house like a permanent mistake. Like we're forgiven, but the consequences can go on. And I was just going to briefly show y'all this one slide. So this was, I'm digressing from the lesson just a little bit. These are protesters in Richardson. This is my husband's place of employment. He works for a defense contractor. This was last month, and this relates to the war in Israel and the Palestinians and the whole thing. So even 2,000 years later, we are still dealing with this halfway around the world, right in our own backyard. I was driving by there that afternoon. Joel warned me, and I was like, whoa. They had people circling the property, and it's just kind of crazy. So, moving on. So I just kind of brushed over God changing names. I think it was the fourth time that he spoke with Abraham. And again, this is my understanding. If you find different information, let me know. I didn't have time to check a million resources, but my understanding was Sarai means my princess. Sarah means simply princess. So the author felt like that by removing the pronoun, that made her, that removed that limiting aspect of her name, that she was a princess to many nations. Abraham's name was originally Abram, which meant exalted father, and it was changed to Abraham, which means father of many nations. So again, it's a more expansive role that God is giving them. These are not, Isaac and Ishmael did not have their names changed, but their names, Isaac, one who laughs or rejoices. And then, I'm not sure that this is 100% correct, but I did look up Ishmael, and it says it's literally translated as God, El, has hearkened, suggesting a child so named was regarded as the fulfillment of a divine promise. So I'm not sure, I'd have to, be another rabbit hole to go down. But did Hagar name Ishmael? Where did that name come from? who is saying it's fulfillment, anyway, that's a whole other situation. Okay, so I've kind of just given you the Reader's Digest version, I feel like, of Sara. It's hard to me, it's hard to just kind of do a deep dive in 30 minutes and glean, and it's just, I feel like it was important to kind of talk about these different aspects and characteristics of her life. Let's talk about some of the positive attributes of Sara, and there were many. She honored her husband almost to a fault. I don't think I would be willing to possibly be taken into a harem. She's called out in Hebrews 11 in the Hall of Faith. She's only one of two women. Rahab is the other one that's called out for her faith. She's considered by some as the matriarch of the Israelites. She was considered very faithful despite stumbling. She followed God's will in moving from Ur and all the subsequent places that they lived. She was hospitable, and we didn't even talk about when the angels came and Abraham saw them from afar off and he said, make a meal. And I mean, she didn't just make a meal, it was like a feast just on the spot. And granted, she probably had servants, but still, that's a pretty tall feat to just do immediately. I mean, to pull that together. She was very meek, faithful. She had a very sincere love for God. She stepped out in faith to follow her husband and dealt with earthly inconvenience mitigated by the promise of eternal blessing. She is often pictured as the ancient epitome of all faithful women. And she did have some weaknesses, just like all of us. So she could be petty, harsh, manipulative. She overrode God's plan in trying to have Hagar have a child. She blamed others for her mistakes sometimes. The author was pretty cutthroat in one of his comments. He said she was the wife of the great patriarch Abraham, so we tend to think of her with a degree of dignity and honor. But reading the biblical account of her life, it's impossible not to notice that she sometimes behaved badly. She could throw fits and tantrums. She knew how to be manipulative, and she was even known to get mean. At one time or another, she exemplified almost every trait associated with a typical caricature of a churlish woman. She could be impatient, temperamental, anyway, it kind of goes on. So anyway, in spite of all those, she is still considered a virtuous and faithful woman, which gives me hope, gives me a lot of hope. So what can we learn from Sara? And before we kind of talk about that a little bit, I think sort of the million-dollar question is, in my mind, or it always has been, why did God take so long to fulfill his promise to them? And I don't think, we're not really told. I mean, to my knowledge, I've wondered after kind of rereading these accounts if perhaps God was trying to strengthen their faith for what was to come. I don't know, we're not really told, but their faith definitely did increase throughout this wait.
Now, Connie, how long was it?
25 years.
25 years?
Yeah, and
That's a while.
well, in the desert, it's like 50. It's like football time, like 75. Yeah, I'm sorry, that's a great point. Yeah, 25 years. And it's one thing to know, so, okay, we have this promise, and I know in 25 years it's going to be fulfilled. But they're not told that. They're just saying, here's a promise, here's a promise, here's a promise. Okay, now 24 years have passed. Now, a year from now, you're going to have a son. So that's a lot of waiting. That's a lot of waiting. I think one thing just like I've kind of talked about, we're all flawed, and we're all flawed. And I think this story has shown me God can use us in spite of our weaknesses if we allow ourselves to be vessels for him, if we're repentant of our mistakes and we allow ourselves to be used by him. Even with our mistakes, he can use us. I also can see God is gracious. He even brought blessings from Abraham and Sarah's willful mistakes. Each time Sarah and Abraham are with the king, they leave. I forgot to say, so the second time, Pharaoh sent all the livestock and servants and everything as well. And even with Ishmael, as difficult as that situation was, he did bless Ishmael's descendants. So, I mean, I think sometimes we don't really think about God blessing us in spite of our mistakes, but if we really look at how gracious he is, he often does that. One thing that I did think about also is that Sara recovered from her mistakes. You know, like Peter denying Christ. She recovered, she regrouped, and she would recover each time. And she remained faithful, and there's a lot to be said for that. So, almost done. So, I guess the one thing I would want us to sort of think about is what is our barrenness? What is the challenge that has really just kind of been extremely difficult for us? Is it professional disappointment? Is it maybe we wanted to have children but we weren't able to have children, or we wanted to be married and that didn't happen, or we've had family disappointments, or life has just been hard, we've had health issues? What is our barrenness? What problem has really driven us to kind of the brink? And how did we deal with that? So questions we could ask ourselves: will we trust God to work through our deepest challenges? Do we fully believe that he will help us and bring us through whatever challenges we face? And how can we express our faith in the meantime, as we're waiting for that child to come into the world? How can we continue to be faithful and express our faith? There's so many verses in the Bible about casting our cares on God, about anxiety, about being at peace, and that, again, that's like a whole other, at least, lesson. But there's so many reassurances of how God is with us. And lastly, I would say, if all else, one thing that I really took from this is we can look to Abraham and Sarah as encouragement, as a source of encouragement and an example to us of faith. So that's it.